Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History Podcast, Episode 3. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. Today's episode is Part 3 of a 4-part series on the Six-Day War, The Die is Cast. This episode covers the opening days of the war, Israel attacking Egypt, then Jordan and Syria joining the war to open a second and third front for Israel. When you are assessing how much military force a country has, there are always debates over the impact of quantity versus quality. For example, you might have the best tank in the world, but if you only have 100 of them and the enemy has 1,000 mediocre tanks, you might not fare very well against them. On the other hand, as the saying went during the heyday of colonialism, quote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not," end quote. A reference to the first machine gun, which enabled European powers to defeat far larger armies that did not have this kind of firepower. This topic is the subject of a good book I've read several times called Brute Force, Allied Strategy and Tactics in the Second World War, which describes the massive materiel advantages the Allied forces had over the Axis and how that enabled them to win. In this book, it describes an account of a German anti-tank gun crew fighting against the Soviets on the Eastern Front. And in it, the Soviets attack and are beaten back by the Germans. Then the Soviets attack again, using the exact same routes and tactics as before, and the result's the same, the Germans defeat them. But then they attack a third time, just as they had the previous 2 times, and this time the anti-tank gun crew ran out of ammunition and their position was overrun. Of course, there are also times it goes the other way. In 1940, the Italians had 150,000 troops defending against 36,000 British troops in North Africa. Yet, it was the British that drove the Italians out of eastern Libya and annihilated the Italian forces with very few losses. So you often don't know how the chips are going to fall until the war itself starts. Well, while Israel certainly has a better trained force in 1967, they are outnumbered and surrounded, and if they fail, their country will be removed from the face of the earth by the Arab nations. So Israel is gambling everything on a surprise attack at the beginning of the war to help level the playing field and counting on their superior quality of troops to overcome the numbers the Arab forces can field. Now, before we get into the opening moves of the war, let's quickly cover the military balance of power in the region. It's June 1967. In the previous month, Egypt massed forces in the Sinai Peninsula, kicking out the United Nations Emergency Force peacekeepers along the border and closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This cut off Israeli access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean beyond it. In particular, the oil shipments they had been receiving from Iran came in through the Strait of Tiran. Now, Syria had been arming and training Palestinian terrorists and sending them into Israel from the West Bank, where they conducted acts of sabotage and violence, as well as periodically shelling Israeli communities with artillery from the Golan Heights. Finally, the Egyptian-Syrian alliance against Egypt is joined by Jordan on May 30th, so now Israel faces enemies on all 3 fronts, to the west, to the east, and to the north, and we'll cover each one in turn. On the west is Egypt, the strongest state in the Arab alliance. The Egyptians have massed 5 infantry divisions, 2 tank divisions, 2 tank brigades, altogether about 100,000 troops, against which the Israelis have 3 divisions and 1 infantry brigade. And these forces have gone through a series of conflicting orders, first occupying defensive positions across the Sinai, then moving forward to offensive positions to strike Israel, until that attack is called off a few days before the war begins. To the east is Jordan, who had been occupying the West Bank since 1948. It has 9 infantry brigades and 2 armored brigades along the West Bank, amounting to about 45,000 troops, or the equivalent of 3 divisions. Furthermore, there is an Iraqi brigade east of the Jordan River and 3 more en route, amounting to a 4th division. Back in 1964, the Arabs created the United Arab Command with plans for it to become operational in 1967 to help the Arab militaries coordinate their actions against Israel, and in particular to allow non-neighboring states such as Iraq or Saudi Arabia to meaningfully commit troops to a war against Israel. Now, the terrain in the West Bank is more hilly and mountainous than the Sinai, but this is also a broad front, and the forces stationed there are more than capable of threatening Israel's major cities on the coast. Israel is only 12 miles wide at some points along the West Bank, and Tel Aviv is only 19 miles from the border. To counter these 12 brigades, the Israelis have only 5. To the north is Syria, situated on the high ground of the Golan Heights, overlooking the Israeli farming settlements along the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee. They have 4 brigades along the Golan Heights who have dug in over the course of nearly 2 decades and equipped their defenses with pillboxes, minefields, and entrenchments. Close behind them are an additional 4 brigades, one of them infantry and 3 armored, in all about 40,000 troops. Along this front, the Israelis have a single armored brigade and a single infantry brigade. Finally, the aerial balance of power, considered here separately from each individual front, because Israel is small enough, the Israeli planes can switch support between the fronts without even having to move to a different airbase. In all, the Israeli Air Force has about 250 combat aircraft against 500 Arab, of which the majority, 400 of them, are Egyptian. Now, knowing they're outnumbered, the Israelis plan on focusing their initial effort on the greatest threat, Nasser's forces in Egypt, and to defeat them as quickly as possible. The Israeli leaders consider a UN-imposed ceasefire likely within 3 days of the war starting, and they want to be able to achieve that goal of defeating the Egyptian forces and reopening the Strait of Tiran before a ceasefire comes down from the UN. In order to maximize the amount of combat force they can bring to bear against the Egyptians, the Israelis are accepting risk on their other fronts by manning them with minimal forces. This follows the dual principles of war known as mass and economy of force. Now, this creates some risk, and to mitigate it, at the strategic level, the Israelis are doing everything possible to avoid opening a second or third front to the war, and they even tell their forces in Jerusalem to ignore small arms fire attacks. Now, the other way the Israelis are trying to counteract the superior numbers of the Arab forces is by leveraging their air power. The Israelis have heavily invested in the Israeli Air Force since the 1956 Suez War, spending about half of their defense budget on the IAF, and the highest quality candidates are going to that service. After much debate in the crisis leading up to the war, the Israelis decide on a bold strategy, a surprise attack from the air to destroy the Egyptian Air Force at the onset of the war. As the Israelis are readying their forces to attack, there are a number of factors that will help them considerably, punching above their weight. The first is maintenance and logistics. Now, this mundane, often overlooked aspect of warfare is absolutely critical to success. In the military, we use the term operational readiness as another way of saying, is your equipment ready to fight? After all, a tank won't do you much good if the engine breaks down and you haven't gotten around to fixing it. The average operational readiness rating of the Arab air forces is around 60 or 70%, which means only about 60 or 70% of their planes are able to fly at any given moment. Now, planes are complex pieces of equipment, and they break down a lot, and it's a lot worse for a plane to stop working in the air versus a tank to stop working on the ground. But the Israelis are able to achieve an average operational readiness rate of about 90%, and in the case of this initial attack of the war, they surge their maintenance capability to get every plane flying. Not only that, the Israelis take the pit crew mentality when it comes to rearming and refueling the planes after they come back from a mission. They can get a plane turned around in about 15 minutes, as opposed to several hours for the Arab nations. Now, this flight rate isn't sustainable in the long term, as it defers maintenance and wears out both the ground crews and the pilots. But it can make a big difference and allows the IAF to have a much bigger impact than its numbers would suggest, especially in the opening days of the war. Secondly, the Israelis are putting the maximum amount of force to the decisive effort, that is, the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force, and allocating minimal forces to other fronts. Out of 250 combat aircraft in their inventory, all but 16 are committed to the attack. Those being held back are trainer aircraft equipped with machine guns. Thirdly, the Israelis have excellent intelligence supporting these operations. The IAF has plotted all the Egyptian radar sites in the area, along with their blind spots and gaps in coverage. You see, most radar systems require a line of sight to detect an aircraft, so aircraft flying at high altitude can be seen much further away, up to several hundred miles, depending on how high they're flying, whereas planes flying very close to the ground can get much closer, around 10 miles or less, before being detected, and this is because the curvature of the Earth hides the aircraft from the radar emitter. Furthermore, terrain can allow aircraft to get even closer, such as hills and valleys may create aerial avenues of approach for low-flying aircraft to fly below the radar coverage. Or planes at low altitude may also be harder to detect, especially for the radars back then, as they may get confused amongst the ground clutter and the radar returns off of the buildings or the vegetation or the wave tops. To take advantage of this knowledge of the Egyptian radar network, the Israelis planned their attack to approach from over the Mediterranean Sea and attack from the west as opposed to the most direct path coming straight over the Negev Desert from the east. The Israelis also have observed the operational patterns of the Egyptian Air Force, and they know that the Egyptians typically fly a dawn patrol as a deterrence against just such a strike, but then they land around 7:30 in the morning, Israeli time, to have breakfast. So thus the Israelis adjust the timing of their attack to strike when the Egyptian aircraft are on the ground. A final advantage the Israelis managed to achieve is the element of surprise. As mentioned before, there are 16 trainer aircraft held back from the strike. These aircraft take off and conduct the typical morning patrols flown by the more capable fighter aircraft, knowing that the radar tracks seen by the Arabs will appear to be identical to the normal dawn patrols, not realizing these are just trainer aircraft flying the same routes. Now, meanwhile, the actual strike itself is flying low levels over the Mediterranean Sea to avoid detection, maintaining radio silence to avoid the possibility someone may pick up their radio signals. Now, this is challenging, especially for such a complex and intricately timed operation, for the Israelis are planning on striking 11 Egyptian air bases at the same time, with their own aircraft taking off from multiple bases throughout Israel. This requires extensive training and trust that each flight will do their part. Ironically, the Israeli strike actually is detected by a Jordanian radar station. This information is relayed to Cairo, but due to a code change the Jordanians weren't tracking, the message goes unread until after the attack. So, thanks to the extensive preparations the Israelis have made, logistics support, and surprise, the Israeli Air Force is posed to launch a knockout blow against the Egyptian Air Force at the very start of the war. The IAF commander, Mahdi Had, told the pilots, quote, "The spirit of Israel's heroes accompany us to battle. From Joshua ben Nun, King David, the Maccabees, and the fighters of 1948 and 1956, we shall draw the strength and courage to strike the Egyptians who threaten our safety, our independence, and our future. Fly, soar at the enemy, destroy him, and scatter him throughout the desert so that Israel may live secure in its land for generations." End quote. The strike itself, called Operation Focus, is launched from multiple Israeli air bases, flies over the Mediterranean at low altitude and radio silence, and then enters Egyptian airspace and attacks 11 air bases from the west, all at the same time. Later in the day, an additional 7 airfields will also be attacked. The aircraft first drop bombs to crater the runways, trapping the Egyptian aircraft on the ground, followed by attacks on the aircraft and support facilities themselves. The Egyptian aircraft are parked in open revetments, that is, protective berms that are built up around the aircraft but without a roof, and the critical targets are the Egyptian heavy bombers, especially 30 Tu-16 Badgers, which can carry a 20,000-pound bomb load and are very fast with a top speed of 650 miles an hour. The Israelis fear these will be used to attack their cities along the coast, particularly if they use chemical weapons, as the Egyptians had been using for years in Yemen. The Israelis conduct a sustained attack over the course of the morning to keep the Egyptians off balance and prevent them from mounting a counterattack. Following the initial attack, the Israelis sustain the attack at lower intensity, typically having one flight of 4 aircraft en route to strike a target, another flight of 4 returning from the strike, and a third flight of 4 refueling and rearming on the ground. Remember, Israel is a small country, so planes flying directly to their targets can reach it in about 20 minutes, which is about as long as it takes the Israelis to rearm and refuel their aircraft. So, with the runways cratered from the initial attack, and subsequent attacks every 20 minutes, the Egyptians have little space and time to recover. The sustained attack lasts for nearly 3 hours as the Israelis go down their target list, ultimately destroying over 300 aircraft for the loss of only 19. Now, the Israelis are stunned by the magnitude of their success. They thought they would suffer much higher casualties, about 25% losses, or over 60 aircraft. Further compounding the success of their initial attack is that it catches the Egyptian command in what can best be described as a tight spot. The Egyptian chief of staff, that is, the commander of the Egyptian army, a man by the name of General Abdel Hakim Amir, is traveling to the Sinai to meet with his top commanders there. All the division commanders, the field army commander, the front commander, the Sinai Air Force commander, and he's accompanied by his operations officer and the Egyptian Air Force commander. Oh, and let me clarify, he is flying to the Sinai at the moment the Israeli Air Force launches its massive attack. And, as it so happened, Amir ordered the Egyptian air defense troops in the area to hold fire in fears that he might get shot down by accident. In NATO armies, the term weapons hold means you don't shoot unless you are directly attacked or have an explicit order to open fire, as opposed to a weapons tight posture in which you fire at targets that you positively identify as enemy, or weapons free, where you fire at targets that you know aren't friendly. Now, undoubtedly, putting the air defense troops on weapons hold helped contribute to the low casualties sustained by the Israelis in the strike. Well, as you can guess, Amir and his generals never made it to the Sinai. They didn't get shot down either, but they did spend an hour and a half trying to find an operational airfield to land at, each time getting turned away due to runway cratering and battle damage. When he finally does manage to land in Cairo, he has to take a taxi to get to the command post, and meanwhile, all the Egyptian commanders in the Sinai Peninsula are waiting for him. And then when they realize he doesn't show up, they're kind of stuck because they aren't willing to return to their command post during daytime out of fears of being struck by marauding Israeli aircraft crisscrossing the Sinai. The centralized nature of the Egyptian command structure meant that deputy commanders were reluctant to take the initiative and deviate from previously established orders, and that slowed the ability of the Egyptians to respond to the Israeli attack. Now, following the Israeli attacks, the Egyptian propaganda machine spins into high gear. They claim the Israelis attacked them, but the Egyptians defeated them, shooting down 86 planes and losing only 2 aircraft. Radio Cairo then goes on to proclaim that the Egyptian Air Force is now bombing Tel Aviv and that the British and the Americans are actively supporting the Israelis with airstrikes of their own. Now, this is a complete lie. The U.S. does have several aircraft carriers in the region, but they are intentionally kept several hundred miles away to avoid getting entangled with the conflict or sparking an incident with the Soviet Union. The Egyptian people cheer in the streets at the news of the war, and Amir, the chief of staff, is elated despite the initial reverses. He thinks that their superior numbers and bringing the other Arab nations into the fight will surely lead them to win the war. Radio Cairo stated, quote, "Our airplanes and our missiles are at this moment shelling all Israel's towns and villages," end quote, and called on, quote, "every Arab to avenge the dignity lost in 1948, to advance across the armistice line into the den of the gang itself, to Tel Aviv," end quote. This Egyptian propaganda convinces Jordan to throw in their lot with Egypt and attack Israel, particularly attacking Israeli positions in West Jerusalem and striking Israeli targets with their small air force of 24 aircraft. We'll focus more on what takes place in Jerusalem and the West Bank later in the episode, but suffice to say, the Jordanian aircraft conduct one ineffective strike, and it is then subsequently wiped out by the Israeli Air Force when they're refueling on the ground. Meanwhile, the Syrians shell border settlements with artillery, and they plan a 3-brigade offensive on Israeli towns along the border. The artillery barrage includes 265 artillery pieces, at one point firing 45 tons of shells every minute. One Israeli settlement, Rosh Pinah, is hit by 1,000 artillery shells alone. However, the Syrian ground attack stalls. A reinforced infantry battalion with 20 T-34 tanks, that is about 600 or 700 troops, attack a single kibbutz, but they're defeated by the local militia. The Syrian ground forces withdraw to the Golan Heights and then hole up in their fortifications, though of course the Syrians proclaim that their offensive was a great success, and they tell everyone that the Israelis are running away towards Haifa. Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, doesn't want to open a third front to the war, so he limits the Israeli response to counter-battery fire and some airstrikes. Now, we're going to focus in on the ground offensive in the Sinai. Now, keep in mind, this is happening at the same time the Jordanians are attacking West Jerusalem, but we'll get to that action later in the episode. As described briefly in Episode 1, the Sinai Peninsula is shaped like an upside-down triangle, with the Suez Canal along the west side, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and the Israeli border to the east. Near the southern tip of the triangle is the Strait of Tiran and the Egyptian army positions that have closed that narrow waterway to Israeli shipping. The southern half of the peninsula consists of rugged mountains, and the northern portion has a small coastal road that's hemmed in by sizable sand dunes around it. Along the northern road is the Gaza Strip, occupied by Egypt since 1948, and the Egyptian town of El Arish. The central route through the Sinai is a major avenue of approach capable of supporting the logistics that a large mechanized army requires. Now, the Egyptians have 2 divisions placed along the northern route, the 20th Division in Gaza itself, and the 7th Division guarding the northern route. In the center, the Egyptians have the 2nd Division in fortified positions at Katef and Abu Agalia. This is where, in 1956, the Israelis surrounded the Egyptian forces, and tried but failed to defeat them despite repeated attacks, and eventually the Egyptians withdrew due to the French and the British landings around the Suez Canal. Finally, along the southern route is the 6th Division. These forces are occupying what in Soviet doctrine is called the disruption zone. They aren't meant to defeat a major enemy attack outright, but they are meant to slow them down, disrupting them, and leaving them vulnerable to defeat either by counterattack or by the defenses of the second echelon forces. In this case, the second echelon forces consist of the 3rd Infantry Division and 4th Tank Division, along with 2 tank brigades in the center. In the south is the Shizali Force, an armored division. Now, of note, the Shizali Force was originally positioned in the northern route around El Arish, but it was drawn down to the south because of Israeli deception efforts. They wanted the Egyptians to believe their main effort would be in the south, as it had been in 1956, when their columns raced forward to relieve the paratroopers they dropped at Mitla Pass. In reality, only a single Israeli brigade was located in the south, augmented with wooden tanks and other decoys to make them seem like a much larger force. Now, the Israeli plan is instead to penetrate Egyptian defenses along the central route, drive on the Suez Canal, and force the Egyptian forces to retreat. And to do this, they allocate 1 division, commanded by Israel Tal, to the northern axis, along with a brigade to contain Gaza. In the center, the Israelis have a 2nd division, commanded by Ariel Sharon, to seize Katef and Abu Agalia. And finally, a 3rd division, commanded by Avraham Yaffe, is attacking through the sand dunes between the northern and the central routes, and his role is to outflank and interdict efforts by the Egyptians to reinforce positions or transfer forces between the north and the center. Now, this brings up a distinction between tactical and operational mobility, a reference to the different levels of war. A quick recap is the tactical level focuses on individual battles. For example, the D-Day landings to seize a bridgehead on Europe could be considered a tactical operation. Then there's the operational level, which ties those individual battles together into an overall campaign, such as the breakout from the Normandy beachheads and the liberation of France. Finally, there's the strategic level, which looks at how these operational campaigns support achieving the national aims, which can include elements such as diplomatic, economic, or informational capabilities and goals. I digress. So, tactically, Yaffe's division is not impeded that much by the sand dunes. All 3 of the Israeli divisions are mechanized with large numbers of tanks and half-tracks that are able to transport infantry across the dunes without much difficulty. However, heavily laden supply trucks have much less ability to go off-road. So while the Israelis are able to get tanks and infantry through the dunes and interdict the Egyptians to transfer forces between the northern and southern route, he is unable to sustain such an advance logistically until either the northern or the central offensive is successful. And that's why the Israelis couldn't just simply send their entire force through the dunes and outflank the Egyptian positions in the north and the center. Such an attack could contribute to the overall operation, but is not logistically feasible in and of itself. So, at the conclusion of the initial Israeli attacks on the airfields, the Israeli command gives the green light for the ground offensive to go forward. Tal's division is initially greeted by Egyptians who think they're friendly troops, but the Egyptians quickly discover otherwise, and resistance stiffens. Tal's orders to his troops seem akin to those Patton gave 20 years earlier, saying, quote, "Everyone attacks, everyone penetrates, without looking sideways or back," end quote. The Israeli forces take heavy losses amidst the Egyptian defenders. While the Israelis isolate Gaza without much trouble, the fighting is particularly fierce along the Jaradi Defile, a pass leading to Al-Arish that's 8 miles long, and that forces the Israelis to fight in a constrained area, going through the Egyptian defenses one at a time. While the Israelis would much prefer flanking maneuvers to avoid frontal attacks like this, the terrain leaves them few options. However, after hours of fighting, the Israelis began to penetrate the Egyptian defenses, and then the Egyptian forces began to withdraw or flee. By the afternoon of the first day, the Israelis are at the outskirts of Al-Arish, and the IDF cancels a planned airborne and seaborne assault that was scheduled for the next day. This frees up a paratrooper brigade for use in the Battle of Jerusalem, which we'll describe later in the episode. Meanwhile, in the center, Ariel Sharon faces the daunting task of seizing the Egyptian positions at Ketef and the village of Abu Agalia. Ketef is a north-south running ridgeline that runs astride the central route going through the Sinai. North of Ketef are sand dunes thought to be impassable to vehicular movement, and to the south, the position is anchored by the mountain Jebel Dalfa. Now, along this ridgeline, the Egyptians dug in 2 lines of trenches and placed minefields, and have arrayed 2 infantry battalions, a tank battalion, and an artillery battalion in the defenses. Now, in their analysis from the Suez War, the Israelis realized that they had trouble attacking the positions here because the Israeli style of decentralized command and rapid movements made it difficult to coordinate multiple forces and synchronize effects to, say, seize a fortified position of this magnitude. Finding the right balance between synchronization and speed is always a balancing act in military command. If you're fully synchronized, well, then you'll be moving at the speed of the slowest asset. Whereas if you move too swiftly, your attacks may be uncoordinated and weak. The first 24 hours of the war would show just how much the Israelis had learned in the 11 years since the Suez War. Sharon's division sends a tank battalion task force to penetrate through the impassable sand dunes north of Ketef to cut off the Egyptians from the rear. And this tank force, comprised of 45 Centurion Mark V tanks, upgunned with the British 105mm rifled gun, along with a company of mechanized infantry, run into an Egyptian defensive position at a place called Position 181. Now, for those unfamiliar with military lingo, when we talk about Hill 181 or Position 181, it's simply a naming convention referring to a hill with a particular height, in this case 181 meters above sea level. Now, the Egyptians are defending Position 181 with an infantry battalion, an artillery battalion, and an anti-tank company. And the first Israeli assault at 10 o'clock in the morning fails. The Israelis regroup and attack again, this time with air support and trying to use their tanks to flank the Egyptians. The fight lasts for several hours before the Egyptians finally abandon their position in the late afternoon. Ultimately, the task force loses 8 tanks, that is 20% of their force, and several key commanders, including a company commander and several platoon leaders. However, fears of an Egyptian counterattack fail to materialize. The Egyptian force in the area remains static. There's no patrolling and no counterattacks because they don't have the orders to do so. This gives the Israeli force time to regroup and continue the advance. Meanwhile, the Israeli tanks are approaching Ketef from the east and take up positions to observe the Egyptians, but they don't commit to an immediate attack. As night falls, the Israelis launch the second part of their plan, an air assault to destroy the Egyptian artillery at Ketef. Now, plenty of things go wrong with the attack. In the initial wave, half of the helicopters get lost, so only about 200 soldiers land in the initial attack. Furthermore, due to the volume of enemy fire on the troops, subsequent waves need to land even further away from the artillery pieces. But after 90 minutes, these soldiers, paratroopers by trade, attack and sow significant confusion among the Egyptian ranks and inflict heavy damage on the Egyptian artillery. This is helped considerably by the Egyptian guns being laid out to protect against air and artillery fire, but there are no defensive minefields or plans to defend against a ground attack. So, in spite of all the difficulties and the mishaps, the Israelis accomplish their mission, and the paratroopers withdraw near midnight to avoid the risk of friendly fire. At 22:45 hours, the Israelis unleashed the largest artillery barrage of the war. 6 battalions, about 100 guns, fire for 30 minutes. And while this is going on, Israeli infantry infiltrate through the sand dunes and then begin their attack against the trenches from the north. This causes a bit of a problem for the Egyptians. They had assumed the sand dunes to the north were impassable, and so they oriented their defensive positions and minefields against an attack from the east. As Israeli infantry attack from the north, they use colored flashlights to mark the positions of the advancing troops, and this allows the tanks to the east, which are providing supporting fire against the Egyptian forces, the ability to accurately engage without running the risk of friendly fire. Now, in conjunction with the infantry attack, sappers began clearing a path through the minefield to allow the Israeli tanks to pass through and attack west to Abu Agalia. However, Egyptian resistance is fierce. At times, the fighting is hand-to-hand with bayonets and knives, but the Egyptian defenders remain static in their positions, oriented east until the Israeli infantry is upon them. There is no counterattack from the Egyptian tanks stationed a few miles west of the trenches, nor are there efforts to reposition the infantry to block or counterattack the Israeli forces. By 02:30, the first lane is cleared through the minefield. However, the first tank column going through is halted when an undetected mine disables a tank in the middle of the lane, blocking the way for follow-on vehicles. It takes another hour and a half until a second route is opened and the tanks can finally pass through. This leads to a night tank battle with the Egyptian tank battalion that lasts until about 6 in the morning, fought at close range against Egyptian tanks in defensive positions. As with the infantry, the Egyptian tanks remain static in their positions and they don't maneuver or counterattack, allowing the Israelis to overpower and outflank them, and eventually to destroy them. By dawn on the second day of the war, Sharon's troops have seized Abu Agalia, dispatching the Egyptian defenses in sharp contrast to what had happened in 1956. And, as I hope this account conveys, many things went wrong in the attack, from the flanking column getting delayed at position 181, to half the air assault landing force getting lost, to the tank getting disabled in the supposedly clear lane. However, the Egyptians were slow to react, whereas the Israelis persevered and improvised to overcome these obstacles, and ultimately prevailed. Now, meanwhile, between the north and the center routes, Yoffe's division makes it through the impassable sand dunes and blocks 2 Egyptian armored brigades that are moving north to Al-Arish. This is another night tank battle, taking place between 2300 and 10 in the morning. But again, the Israelis are able to maneuver against the Egyptian forces and destroy them, whereas the Egyptians are slower to react and respond. And just a quick note on the Israeli army here. Due to their small size and population base, Israel relies upon its citizen soldiers to fight major wars. There is a professional corps of the Israeli Defense Forces, and those are augmented by draftees that serve for a few years before going to join the reserves. But during a crisis, those reserves are mobilized to fill out the ranks. And this doesn't just happen at the lowest ranks. Avraham Yoffe fought in the 56 War and commanded Southern Command for a time afterwards. But just 1 month prior to the war breaking out, Avraham Yoffe was in reserve status and was serving as the director of Israel's Nature Protection Society. Then the crisis occurs, he's called up, and in a matter of days, he's now placed in command of one of the 3 divisions supporting the main ground effort of the war. Now, meanwhile, at Egyptian headquarters, there is a mixture of confusion and confidence. The chief of staff, Amir, is reportedly drunk, screaming orders into the telephone, and depressed, and Nasser is nowhere to be seen. Following the shock of the Israeli attack, he retreats into his residence and remains there for 3 days. And while he's not necessarily in complete isolation, like Stalin was after the initial attacks by the Germans in 1941, he is certainly not in the headquarters giving direction or encouragement to the generals. Now, the confident side goes back to the Egyptian thinking in the lead up to the war, where they thought even if the Israelis do attack us first, and even if they do manage to surprise us, we have enough combat power between ourselves and the Jordanians and the Syrians and our other allies that we are surely going to be able to overcome this initial attack and overwhelm Israel and defeat them. And so this war breaking out, even though the Israelis caught us by surprise, is still going to be victorious. Politically, the Egyptians spread the lie that the Americans and the British are directly assisting Israel. This serves a dual purpose of explaining why their air force was so badly defeated at the onset of the war, and they also hope it can convince the Soviet Union to provide them with more support or even intervene directly in the conflict on their behalf. Radio Cairo continues its broadcasts saying, quote, "America, United States is the enemy. The United States is the hostile force behind Israel. The United States, O Arabs, is the enemy of all peoples, the killer of life, the shedder of blood, that is preventing you from liquidating Israel." End quote. The Syrians join in on the lie, claiming that the British are bombing them from Cyprus, and so do the Jordanians, claiming 3 American carriers are operating off the coast and conducting airstrikes. Outraged, Arab mobs attack American embassies throughout the Middle East. Of course, despite the outrage and the setbacks, the Egyptians don't actually want a ceasefire, and neither do the Israelis for that matter. For the Arabs, many of them think that they are winning thanks to their own propaganda. Sure, some of the top leaders know that they're broadcasting lies, but not everyone does, and even if you know it's a lie, sometimes you can believe it if you say it enough. The only reason Jordan joined the war wholeheartedly is because of the lies the Egyptians were telling about the initial Israeli attack. Not only that, but with the promise of reinforcements from the Arab world and their seemingly overwhelming numbers, they are sure that they're going to win despite the initial setbacks. Likewise, the Israelis don't want a ceasefire either because they're winning, and they want the war to last long enough to accomplish their war goals, which, at this point in the war, is destroying the Egyptian forces in the Sinai, reopening the Straits of Tiran, and, now with fighting breaking out in West Jerusalem, they want to control the whole city. However, as news filters up to the Egyptian command throughout the second day, it becomes impossible to ignore the truth. Upon hearing about the fall of Abu Agalia, the Egyptian leadership is both surprised and demoralized, especially given how much they had lauded their ability to hold that position for many days in the 56 war. Then news comes back about Yoffe's division blocking reinforcements moving north to Al-Arish, and so, at 1630 hours on the 6th of June, Amir calls for a general retreat of Egyptian forces to the Suez Canal. Now, a withdrawal under pressure, which is another way of saying a retreat or retrograde operation while the enemy is still in contact with you, is one of the hardest military operations to conduct. You see, throughout history, most casualties in battle don't take place in the initial clash of forces. Instead, most casualties occur when one side turns and runs. Part of this is practical. It's a lot easier to kill or capture someone when they're running away instead of trying to fight back. But a lot of it is also psychological. Fear is contagious, and that can cripple a military force in short order. I saw it firsthand when I was a platoon leader at the National Training Center many years ago. My platoon was engaged in a firefight, and I pulled an element back to the FOB to bring out additional reinforcements. However, some of my troops saw our guys retreating back to the FOB, and they thought they had missed word of a general withdrawal. Afraid of being left behind, they too turned and ran. And before I knew it, my entire platoon is running back to the FOB, and no one is standing and fighting back against the insurgents. Now, likewise, when withdrawing under enemy pressure, there is always that fear of being left behind or cut off, and that can cause troops to abandon their positions or their equipment out of a desire to save themselves. So to be successful, these kinds of withdrawals need to be carefully planned and rehearsed. Typically it's done as a phased withdrawal, where a portion of the troops remain in defensive positions to keep the enemy off your back, and then the remainder of your force withdraws. Once that main body of troops is withdrawn, then your rear body falls back as well, typically under the cover of night or some sort of obscuration or distraction to keep the enemy from pursuing you. You may have subsequent fallback positions in order to keep the enemy from pursuing you rapidly. Now, of course, executing this also requires disciplined troops who are going to stay in those rearguard positions until the rest of the army is away, even at the risk of their own lives. Now, the Egyptian army in 1967 did none of these things. Indeed, Amir gave his staff a mere 20 minutes to develop the plan for a general withdrawal of over 100,000 troops to the canal. Now, in this short amount of time, they sketch out a 3-day phased withdrawal to the north-south mountains that run just east of the canal and the mountain passes that go through there, and then finally from there a withdrawal across the canal itself. Amir rejects the plan outright, saying, quote, "I gave you an order to withdraw, period," end quote. Then Amir calls the forces in the Sinai directly to give them the order to withdraw. Now, the Egyptian withdrawal quickly turns into a rout. Colonel Avraham Adan, Yoffe's second in command, related this experience to his debriefers after the war, and he said, quote, "You ride past burnt-out vehicles, and suddenly you see this immense army, too numerous to count, spread out across a vast area as far as your eyes can see. It was not a pleasant feeling seeing this gigantic enemy and realizing that you're only a single battalion of tanks," end quote. Or, as Dr. Abdel Fattah al-Tarki in this Egyptian 2nd Tank Brigade said, quote, "Everybody lost their heads. We were told to withdraw to Bir al-Tamada, but we arrived to find the position there already in flames. The army on the roads was in a state of complete collapse. It was a massacre, a disaster. Israel never would have achieved a quarter of its victory if not for the confusion and chaos," end quote. No one wants to be left behind. It takes strong leadership and disciplined troops to resist the urge of self-preservation and to conduct an orderly withdrawal. For many units, one or both were lacking. For example, the 3rd Division commander, General Uthman Nasser, told his officers he had an urgent meeting at headquarters and then departed, never to return. He was not the only Egyptian general to abandon his troops and flee to Cairo. Now, there were several Egyptian units that defended their positions bravely, and some leaders that stuck with their troops, but in the end it wasn't enough to make a difference. And certainly the psychological impact of Israeli air supremacy also plays a factor here. From a material sense, air attacks may not do a lot of damage in a single sortie. However, put yourself in the shoes of an Egyptian soldier in 1967, where the Israeli aircraft are ruling the skies with impunity, and due to their speed, they can appear seemingly anywhere, anytime, with sudden swiftness, deliver their cargo of death. Even if you're moving through rare areas, you know that you aren't safe because the aircraft may show up at any time, and indeed, just seeing enemy aircraft nearby may be enough to cause your forces to stop movement, disperse, and try and hide out of fears that an attack may be imminent. As a result, many troops abandon their equipment and flee. If your vehicle breaks down or it gets stuck in a traffic jam or runs out of gas, well, many soldiers reason it's better to be alive without your tank than to wait around for a tow, and so they abandon their tanks or their vehicles when they get stuck, and they continue the retreat on foot. Many of the withdrawing troops that are walking to the canal, they start abandoning their weapons and equipment out of a fear that it'll slow them down and let them get caught by the Israelis. And this leads to a highway of death situation akin to what happened during the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. There are large columns of stranded vehicles being hit by IAF airstrikes, while Israeli tanks are chasing the Egyptian forces and literally trying to head them off at the passes leading towards the canal. Compounding this are instances of friendly fire, including one in which Egyptian artillery is firing on advancing infantry from the east until they get close enough to realize that they're shelling retreating Egyptian troops. By the end of the 2nd day, the Egyptian army has been defeated in the Sinai. While there is significant combat power remaining on paper, notably the 4th Tank Division in the center and the Shazali Force to the south, the withdrawal order quickly turns into a rout. Furthermore, Egyptian resistance in Gaza collapses, and the Israelis, quick to adapt and respond to emerging opportunities, are pursuing the Egyptians as fast as they can go. The Israeli leadership don't know what to do. They never thought that they would advance so far so quickly. All right, we're now going to shift our focus from the Sinai over to the West Bank and the fight emerging in Jerusalem. We're going to wind back to the first day of the war. The Israeli attack on Egypt is a massive success, but the Egyptians publicly tell of a great victory against Israel and that their forces are bombing Tel Aviv. King Hussein, who just a week prior signed an alliance with the Egyptians and Syrians against Israel, he believes the Egyptians and joins the war. After conducting one ineffective airstrike, the Israelis destroyed the entire Jordanian air force on the ground. And remember, the Jordanian armed forces are nominally under Egyptian command as part of the terms of the alliance. There is some debate over how much that actually had an impact on Jordanian forces during the war. You see, the initial Jordanian plan for the war is to focus on seizing all of Jerusalem. At the time of the armistice in 1949, the Israelis controlled the western half of the city and the Jordanians the eastern half, which included the Temple Mount and other holy sites. King Hussein knew that the Jordanian armed forces weren't large enough to hold all of the West Bank against a determined Israeli attack, but he reasoned that if they seized all of Jerusalem, they could exchange territory there for territory they would likely lose in the West Bank. However, with the Egyptian attack seemingly successful, an alternative plan is briefly considered of attacking southwest into the Negev desert to link up with the Egyptian forces supposedly advancing northeast to meet them. This would use Jordan's 2 armored brigades, but would not affect the other forces defending in the West Bank nor the fighting in Jerusalem. However, when it became apparent that the Egyptians were actually being driven from the field themselves, the Jordanians reverted to their original plan. Now, the Israelis in Jerusalem were under strict orders to ignore Jordanian small arms fire or shelling. The Israelis did not want to open a second front because they have about 2/3 of their combat power facing the Egyptians, and the remaining forces are acting as an economy of force against Jordan and Syria. The Israelis hope the Jordanians may make some symbolic gesture of solidarity by shooting some artillery rounds or engaging in a few firefights, but not conduct a full offensive. Indeed, the Israelis only have 50 tanks, all of them Sherman tanks, 36 artillery pieces, and 27 mortars to defend Tel Aviv, a mere 19 miles from the border with Jordan. In all, there are only 5 brigades arrayed against Jordan, 2 in the north near the Jezreel Valley, 1 in Jerusalem, 1 defending Tel Aviv, and 1 defending the international airport at Lod, which is later renamed the Ben Gurion Airport after David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. However, the Jordanians began their plan to seize Jerusalem. They first strike by seizing Government Hill, which is neutral territory controlled by neither the Israelis or the Jordanians. Instead, it contains the headquarters for UN observers who are housed in the appropriately named Government House. However, Government Hill and its adjoining ridgeline is key terrain for control of the city. The hill overlooks the city and would assist either side in isolating the opposing forces within Jerusalem. With this under control, the Jordanians began planning an assault on Mount Scopus, which is an isolated Israeli position surrounded by Jordanian territory in Jerusalem. In response to this overt Jordanian offensive action, the IDF authorizes an offensive into the West Bank by their 2 armored brigades near the Jezreel Valley, and they began planning an attack to relieve Mount Scopus and retake Government Hill. The forces in Jerusalem conduct a fierce fight over Government Hill. The Israelis attack with 2 infantry companies supported by 8 Sherman tanks, and in the attack, 7 of the 8 Shermans are knocked out, and the Israeli infantry suffers heavy casualties. But they ultimately prevail, clearing the compound with small arms fire and hand grenades. Now, if you recall from the Sinai front, Israel Tal's division in the north broke through the Jaradi defile and seized Al-Arish, canceling a planned airborne and seaborne attack on the second day of the war. This frees up the 55th Paratrooper Brigade, which is then rushed to Jerusalem on trucks. They have precious little time to prepare for the fighting, about 5 hours or so, planning now to operate in a completely different area with different terrain against a different enemy. But as Colonel Arik Akman, the intelligence officer from the 55th, said, quote, "The problem was not how to do it right, but how to avoid doing it terribly," end quote. Ever since the 1949 armistice, the Israelis lamented their failure to seize all of Jerusalem. Remember, from the first episode, the Temple Mount is the holiest site in Judaism, and Jerusalem is synonymous with the Jewish identity. being the center of worship for God for thousands of years. And not only that, it was the capital, historically, of Judea, from which the words Jewish and Judaism derive from. And so taking all the city is a key Israeli goal, and doing it quickly before a ceasefire is imposed. And so, despite being unprepared for and untrained in urban warfare, the 55th Paratrooper Brigade is thrown into the breach. Their focus was on seizing Ammunition Hill, a hill located in northern Jerusalem that controls the approaches to these Israeli positions on Mount Scopus. The paratroopers attack at night, beginning around 1:30 in the morning, against the heavily fortified Jordanian positions. Now, the Jordanians have a minefield 300 meters deep, as well as 6 layers of barbed wire, 4 of which weren't on the Israeli maps. Lacking any mine-clearing equipment, the Israelis attack anyways, with tanks being disabled and the initial assault units suffering heavy casualties. Indeed, some are virtually annihilated. However, the Israelis push forward with determination and grit, and despite having 25% of their attacking battalion killed, the Jordanians are forced back and abandon the hill. Much like what happened to the Egyptians at Katef, the Jordanians fought bravely and well, but they lacked flexibility, and when their defensive perimeter was finally breached, most Jordanian soldiers remained at their posts, watching their assigned sectors, instead of organizing a counterattack or shifting positions to counter the Israeli advance. By the second day of the war, the Israelis began advancing into the city and managed to isolate Jordanian forces in the Old City. During this advance, there are some fierce firefights, but that's the nature of urban warfare. Engagement ranges are short, there are many places for infantry to hide, and it's difficult for armored vehicles to be employed effectively in the constricted terrain. Yigal Ner, a paratrooper, described one such instance where his battalion took a wrong turn and ran into a Jordanian kill zone. Quote, "Suddenly the street turned into a slaughterhouse. In seconds, everyone around me was hit. Having not felt fear before, the transformation was drastic. I felt abandoned and suddenly hopeless." End quote. There are also some friendly fire incidents due to limited visibility, the changing situation, and the dense urban environment. However, the Israelis advance, and the Israeli leaders debate over whether to launch an assault to seize the Old City or simply to lay siege to it. They are particularly aware of the potential damage to the holy sites, since the Old City contains the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock, and the risk of international rebuke. So, for the time, the Israelis avoid going into the Old City and just lay siege to it. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the hilly terrain there restricts the armored forces from advancing freely and makes it much easier for the Jordanians to identify defensive positions along these avenues of approach to hold against the Israelis. The Israeli advance runs into the Jordanian 40th Armored Brigade, a well-trained and well-equipped force armed with American M48 Patton tanks, which are heavily armored to the point where the Sherman and AMX-13 light tanks the Israelis have are unable to penetrate the frontal armor. This blocks the Israeli route of advance for a time, and a Jordanian counterattack makes some progress at night. But daylight on the second day brings with it the Israeli Air Force, and with the help of air support and aggressive maneuver, the Israelis are able to force the Jordanians to withdraw. Meanwhile, promised Arab reinforcements to the West Bank fails to emerge. The Syrian 17th Mechanized Brigade makes its way to the Jordanian border, but once it gets there, it refuses to cross it. Their commander says that he needs to do a more thorough reconnaissance before advancing, and that he doesn't have official orders from Damascus to do so. Meanwhile, a Saudi brigade approaches the Jordan River bridges, but fails to enter the West Bank or see combat. And indeed, the only foreign brigade that actually makes it to the West Bank is the Iraqi 8th Brigade, which is subsequently decimated by Israeli air power and fails to play a significant role in the fighting. By late afternoon on the second day, Israeli advances into the West Bank threaten the bridges over the Jordan River. Indeed, this threatens to isolate the bulk of the Jordanian army on the west side of the river. You see, the reason why the Israelis are able to make such an advance despite being outnumbered is because of the way the Jordanian army is arrayed in the West Bank. Out of political considerations, the Jordanians didn't want to abandon any Palestinian territory to the Israelis, and so they spread their infantry brigades across the entire border. As a result, when the Israelis concentrated their 2 brigades to attack from the north, they much outnumbered the defenders that they were facing in their sector, and they only were stopped by the 40th Armored Brigade, which was one of the reserve forces the Jordanians had at their disposal, that was not committed to the border itself. So therefore, when the 2 Israeli brigades penetrated into the West Bank from the north, this left many of the Jordanian brigades simply out of place. King Hussein refuses to order evacuation, and to his credit, he goes to the front in a jeep to see the situation for himself. He is the only Arab leader in the war to do so. On his way there, he sees the retreating remnants of the 25th Infantry and 40th Armored Brigades, and he later recounted, quote, "I will never forget the hallucinating sight of that defeat. Roads clogged with trucks, jeeps, and all kinds of vehicles twisted, disemboweled, dented, still smoking, giving off that particular smell of metal and paint burned by exploding bombs, a stink that only powder can make. In the midst of the charnel house were men, in groups of 30 or 2, wounded, exhausted. They were trying to clear a path under the monstrous coup de grace being dealt them by a horde of Israeli mirages, screaming in a cloudless blue sky, seared with sun." End quote. At 23:15 on the 6th of June, the second day of the war, Nasser cables King Hussein, admitting to the loss of his air force and the defeat of his ground forces. He advises King Hussein to evacuate the West Bank and hope for a UN ceasefire. Given, in effect, permission to withdraw, King Hussein orders the troops to withdraw shortly thereafter, every man for himself, to make it to the east side of the Jordan River. He was reluctant to do so earlier, out of concerns that he would become a scapegoat for the Arab defeat, and that the Egyptians and Syrians would use that to undermine his regime's legitimacy and stage a coup or uprising to depose him. Now, 2 hours later, King Hussein reconsiders his order and decides to rescind it. He heard that a UN ceasefire was imminent, perhaps as close as 24 hours away, and so he wanted to hold on to as much territory as possible. However, as with the Egyptians, once the order to retreat has been given, his armies fell apart, and nothing would stop the Israelis until they seized the entire West Bank. Now, in the international scene, King Hussein appealed to the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France for help in securing an immediate ceasefire. He claimed that his regime would not survive 1 hour without an immediate end to the violent attacks. Now, the Soviets and the United States both want a ceasefire in the region, and they desire to remain neutral in the fighting. The U.S. is relieved that the Soviets are seeking peace instead of wanting to turn this flashpoint into another standoff between East and West, and, in words that would foreshadow the planet of the neutrals in Futurama, the U.S. State Department spokesman Robert McCloskey stated that, quote, "Our position is neutral in thought, word, and deed," end quote. By the evening of the second day, June 6th, the Soviets expressed support for a ceasefire in place instead of withdrawing to the pre-war borders. This ceasefire resolution passes at the United Nations to go into effect at 1300 the following day. The Israelis accept the ceasefire, since, having claimed to be fighting a defensive war, which they are now winning, they couldn't turn around and say that they needed to keep fighting to gain more territory for a peace settlement. Under pressure by the collapse of their army, Jordan also accepts the ceasefire. However, the Egyptians reject the ceasefire. El-Koni, the Egyptian ambassador to the United Nations, asks Cairo for instructions and was told categorically to reject any resolution that does not have unconditional withdrawal of Israeli troops to the pre-war borders. And for good measure, he also denounces the United States and the United Kingdom for supposedly conspiring with the Israelis. And so, the war goes on, and it will only get worse for the Arabs. By the start of the third day, June 7th, it's clear the Israelis have pulled off a major upset and the tide of war is in their favor. But how will the war end? Will the Syrians launch a coordinated ground offensive and open a third front to the war? And despite their significant losses, the Arab nations do have a significant manpower and material advantage over the Israelis, and other Arab countries are pledging support and sending arms to help. Will they arrive in time to make a difference? And what of the Soviet Union? How will the Soviets react to the defeat of one of their client states in the Middle East? Well, tune in next time for the fourth and final part of our series on the Six-Day War. That episode will look at the conclusion of the fighting against Egypt and Jordan, the opening of the front against Syria, and an incident which kills 34 Americans and wounds a further 172. Thank you, and have a good day.